We now begin a look at the second half of the unit that looks at religious developments, Romanticism, the Transcendentalists, and the social reform movements that grew out of the era. During the Age of Enlightenment in the mid-18th century, there had been a movement away from organized religion and a renewed focus on science and reason. As many of the founding fathers had been educated during this era, the American Revolution had largely been a secular affair. They clearly demonstrated their opposition to the intermingling of politics and religion by establishing a sense of separation of church and state, which is seen to some extent in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. In part because religion was separated from the control of political leaders, a series of religious revivals swept the United States, beginning in the 1790s and lasting through the 1830s, that would transform the religious landscape of the country. Known as the Second Great Awakening, this spiritual resurgence would fundamentally alter the character of American religion. At the start of the Revolution, the largest denominations in the U.S. were the Congregationalists, which were the descendants of the Puritan churches, the Anglicans, known after the Revolution as Episcopalians, and the Quakers. But the evangelical impulse at the heart of this Second Great Awakening would share some of those revolutionary ideals, generally, for example, having more of a populist orientation that favored ordinary people over elites. Individual piety was seen as more important for salvation than the formal university training that was required of ministers in traditional Christian churches. There's no specific starting point for the beginning of this Second Great Awakening, because it developed in multiple locations and in multiple denominations. But the Reverend Timothy Dwight, as president of Yale College, would be among those identified by historians as being near to the beginning. He noticed that his students were drawn to radical republicanism and the so-called infidel philosophy associated with the French Revolution, and he hoped to rein this in with religious revivals on his campus, and he was already seen as a reformist minister. The immense success of the Second Great Awakening was also furthered by the innovative organizational techniques of the evangelical churches, and they were very well suited to the frontier conditions of the newly settled territories. Most of the evangelical churches relied on traveling preachers to reach large areas that did not have an established minister, and would also include important places for lay people to take on major religious and administrative roles. In the Appalachian region of Tennessee and Kentucky, the revival would energize Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists, and give rise to the popular camp meeting, a chance for isolated frontier folk to gather and enjoy the excitement of evangelistic fervor. In northern New England, the focus was more on social activism, and further to the west, particularly as you get towards the end of the Erie Canal in western New York, the movement would encourage the growth of new religious denominations. Much like in the Trans-Appalachian West, in western New York, professional and established clergy were few and far between, and the area would prove to be enthusiastic for new religions. And in fact, so many revivals took place there that the area came to be known as the Burned-Over District. The area would also be where many utopian communities would establish themselves, somewhat separate from the rest of society. Another group growing out of this burned-over district was a religion founded by a man named Joseph Smith, who incorporated a variety of different beliefs into the creation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Smith founded his religion after receiving a vision that he called was a visitation of an angel of God who revealed a new book of the Bible to him, the Book of Mormon. Smith and his followers attracted many to this new religion, though there was quite a bit of opposition to it, especially for their practice of polygamy, eventually resulting in Smith being driven out of New York. Heading westward, they eventually ended up in Illinois, where in 1844 both Smith and his brother were killed in a mob confrontation. Brigham Young then took the fledgling church out of U.S. territory altogether, settling on the banks of the Great Salt Lake in the Mexican territory of Utah. Although it wasn't long before the territory ended up in the hands of the U.S. again, after the Mexican cession became U.S. property in 1848. Utopian communities also grew out of this Second Great Awakening, many of which were religious communities unto themselves, and others were part of larger networks. One of these groups, the Shakers, was a collection of 18 major long-term societies that had been founded by 1836. Each of these communities were comprised of some 60 families, though there were many smaller, short-lived communities as well, some in the southeastern U.S., even an urban location in Philadelphia. Another community was the Oneida community, based out of New York. They believed that Jesus had already had the second coming, that he had returned to earth back in the year 70 A.D., making it possible for them to bring about his millennial kingdom themselves, to possibly be completely free of sin and to be perfect in this world, not just in heaven. Other utopian communities included Brook Farm in Massachusetts and New Harmony in Indiana. One other thing, though, that most of these communities had in common was a belief in what is called communalism, a sense of communal holding of property and possessions, a communal shared experience, the success of the community dominating any individual efforts. They frequently held themselves apart from the rest of society and usually tried to live both simplistically and self-sufficiently. Women made up the majority of converts during this Great Awakening, and they played a crucial role in its development and focus. Now, there's some discrepancy as to why women converted in larger numbers than men, including theories that women were had a greater sense of religious fervor than men. There's an idea that they were asserting themselves in the face of a patriarchal rule. But regardless as to why, church membership and religious activities gave women peer support as well as a place for meaningful activity outside of the home. This would provide many women with a communal identity and shared experiences. Now, despite the predominance of women in the movement, they were not given any formal leadership ministerial positions, but they did take on other public roles, for example, relaying testimonials about their conversion experience or assisting sinners through the conversion process. They would also take on crucial roles in the conversion and religious upbringing of children, because mothers were seen as the moral and spiritual foundation of the family and were thus tasked with instructing children in matters of religion and ethics. The greatest change in women's roles, though, stemmed from participation in newly formalized missionary and reform societies. Women's prayer groups were an early and socially acceptable form of women's organization. Through their positions in these organizations, women gained influence outside of the private sphere. Along with the Second Great Awakening came an idealistic, philosophical, and social movement known as Transcendentalism. It developed in New England around 1836 in reaction to the rationalism of the Revolutionary era. They were a group of people that were struggling to define spirituality and religion in a way that took into account the new understandings of their age. This new generation looked at the previous generation's rebellions, believing that those revolutions had not gone far enough and had stayed too much in the rational mode. They were heavily influenced by Romanticism and taught that divinity was present in all nature and all humanity. Many of its members also held progressive views on feminism and communal living. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau would be central figures. As writers, these people, mostly New Englanders and mostly around Boston, were attempting to create what they saw as a uniquely American body of literature. It had already been decades since the Americans had won political independence from England. Now they believed it was time for literary independence, and so they deliberately went about creating literature, essays, novels, philosophy, poetry, and other writings that were clearly different from anything from England, France, Germany, or any other European nation. The individuals most closely associated with this new way of thinking were connected loosely through a group known as the Transcendental Club, which met in Boston. Their chief publication was a periodical called The Dial, edited by Margaret Fuller, a political radical and feminist. The club had many extraordinary thinkers, but accorded the leadership position to Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was a Harvard-educated essayist and lecturer, and is recognized as the first truly American thinker. In his most famous essay, The American Scholar, he urged Americans to stop looking to Europe for inspiration and imitation, and to just be themselves. He believed that people were naturally good, and that everyone's potential was limitless. He inspired his colleagues to look into themselves, into nature, into art, and through work for answers to life's most perplexing questions. His intellectual contributions to the philosophy of Transcendentalism would inspire this uniquely American idealism and spirit of reform. Other members during the mid-19th century included Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Walt Whitman. But by far the most interesting character was Henry David Thoreau, who tried to put Transcendentalism into practice. Thoreau, for 2 years, actually carried out a most famous experiment in self-reliance when he went to Walden Pond and built a hut and tried to live as self-sufficiently as possible, in unity with all things nature. He didn't want any interference of society. And then he later wrote about his experience, his faith in humanity, his sturdy individualism. He reminded everyone that life was wasted pursuing wealth and social customs, and that nature could show that all good things are wild and free.